Those of you who came on Friday night or know the story of Easter, which almost everyone does, the Friday night episode ends most dramatically with Jesus having been arrested, having been tortured, humiliated, completely all his seeming power taken away from him, and carrying his cross to the place of crucifixion, nailed on the cross, and after a time he announces from the cross, "It is finished." Then he breathes his last and his spirit goes out from him. The disciples are in a state of absolute shock. First, that he was arrested, but even more profoundly, that even after his arrest, nothing of the power that they had seen from him is manifested to extricate himself from this. Bear in mind that many times in the 3 years of his ministry, he was face to face with powerful forces who desired to end his life, even picking up stones and threatening to stone him, and always, each time, he slipped away from them by natural or miraculous means. But that threat would come, and then he would escape. So they had no reason to believe, except those perhaps who were more finely attuned to him, because he had tried to tell them. But they had no reason to believe that even after he was taken, that his power would not triumph. But it did not. He was dead, as far as they knew. And the forces that had killed him were also hunting them. The whole community now of priests and their own family, their own temple, had now declared that this man was indeed blasphemous. They had taken him away, and now it was frightening to be one of his disciples. And this is the story of Peter, to whom Jesus says 3 times before this night is past that you will deny that you even knew me. And in fact, in the panic of the moment, that's exactly what Peter does. So then Jesus is now killed, and the Sabbath has begun, and 2 of his secret disciples, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, who have the power to relate to the priests, "Give us his body," they say. All right, so they take the body down, and without any ceremony, because the Sabbath is coming and nothing can be done on the Sabbath, they carry his body away to a tomb, to a new unused tomb. They roll the rock back, they wrap him in the winding sheets without giving him much of the dignity of death or the ritual of death. Just lay him in there, roll the stone over. Now, Mary Magdalene has been one of the few of Jesus' disciples who had the courage to go all the way to the foot of the cross. But still, powerless, she watches him die. And no one has the courage, now that the Sabbath has come and all action is forbidden, to go out and do anything about his death. So imagine, for this period of time, they just have to wait. Just not knowing what's going to happen. Now each devotee, each disciple in his own way, little is written, nothing is written about what those days were like. But imagine. Now imagine also, this is the exact analogous to how many times have we had experiences of almost unutterable pain and suffering for whatever cause. And we have that time passes when the blow has fallen, the unimaginable has taken place, and we have no idea when this suffering will ever end, or if it will ever end. Now we know the whole end of the story, but the disciples did not. What a test of faith, above all, isn't it? It's very easy to believe when the Master is standing there and you're marching behind him and he's speaking in such a glorious way and he's standing up to the authorities, and even when they threaten them, he has the power to get away. And even if others are against you, you still have him right there with you. And you can imagine in your own mind how this story is going to end, as all the disciples did, that he was their king, that he would rescue them, that he would be recognized. What else could they hope for? Who would not hope for such a thing? Darkness, all of it gone. But they held to their faith. And the first light of dawn on the morning, as soon as the Sabbath was over, while it was yet dark, you can imagine Mary Magdalene just waiting for the first possible moment. And she runs to the tomb. She doesn't merely walk, she runs to the tomb. And in her mind, she's thinking, and some of the Gospels say that she was not alone, that there was another woman with her, and they were talking about how are we going to get the stone pushed aside to be able to get into the tomb. They had a project. They wanted to at least honor his body in the way that it should be honored. How are we going to get that big stone moved away? So she comes to the tomb. The first thing that happens is the stone is already gone. How could it be gone? So she thinks, someone has stolen his body. Because what could happen that would be worse at this point? Everything terrible has happened, now it's going to get worse. Because she looks in the tomb, and his body is gone. They have taken away the Lord. What is going to happen here? And she becomes overwhelmed with grief. And she runs back to Simon and Peter. Now, the mere fact that they're still all together is a very important point, because they're clinging to each other in faith. They've lost the master, but they have one another. And this is a critical moment when we feel deserted or tortured by the forces of this world. Do we withdraw into ourselves? Do we reject those who have been our friends? Do we feel that now that things have gone wrong, I have to reject everything that I was doing before? Or do we cling in faith to one another? So she runs and she gets Peter and John. And they come racing with her to see. They've taken him away, and they all run in. And John comes into the tomb, and he sees the winding sheets, what he's been wrapped in. And the Gospel tells us the ones that were wrapped around his body were in one place, and the one that was wrapped around his head was in another. And of course, that's put in there as if he himself unwrapped it and then unwrapped the other and set it aside. Now, this man was dead. They all knew he was dead. He was put into this tomb, the rock was rolled over, and there seems to be evidence that he got up again and just took off the garments that he was wearing. Now bear in mind, all of these people knew that Lazarus had been resurrected. Lazarus had just walked out of the tomb. Remember, he was wrapped in the winding sheets. We talked about this on Palm Sunday. And Jesus just called him. He's been 3 days there, 4 days in there. Come forth, Lazarus. And Lazarus walks out wrapped in these sheets, and they must have taken the sheets off of him. So there was a place in their mind. There was a place in their experience, not merely in their imagination, for this to be true. So John immediately understands this is what has happened. But Mary is weeping and weeping, and she turns and she sees a man there. And at first she doesn't understand, who is this man standing there? And he says, "Why are you weeping, woman? Why are you weeping?" And she says, "They've taken away my Lord." She still can't believe anything but that he's gone. And he says, "Mary." And then in that moment it comes over her that she's looking at the resurrected Jesus. And she says, "Rabbi," which means master. And she falls at his feet. What a moment. It's the epitome for every one of us, of every experience we've ever had, where complete darkness and despair descends, and we are certain that it will never end. And even we speak to the very ones who are going to rescue us, and we say, "They've taken him away, everything is hopeless, what am I going to do?" And when the mind is committed to that, it's so profoundly and deeply committed. One of the reasons that hell is described as eternal is because when we're in that state of suffering, we can't remember the light. We just imagine that this will go on forever. And so it feels like eternity. It feels like it's never ending. But then, suddenly, Jesus is standing there in front of her. And she realizes that even though it all happened, it was all not what it seemed. You see? And that's that very subtle truth about life that spiritual life is trying to teach us. It all happens. It's insensitive to say, oh, don't be unhappy, God is bliss. This is not really a problem. So what if death has come to your family, or illness, or profound disappointment? Don't worry about it like that. And sometimes in ourselves we'll say, well, the spiritual attitude is to feel this way. This is how I feel. Sometimes in our community we joke a little bit, because when someone is in the throes of some great challenging experience, compassion is in order. It doesn't help just to quote scripture at such a moment. There's something we call true but irrelevant. You know? It may be a true fact, but it's not relevant at the moment because it's not what I can reach. At the same time, here's an interesting balance to that. Swami Kriyananda, the founder and the leader of our community here, it is a great and loving and compassionate man, and a wonderful counselor. But he advises us when counseling others. He said, be sympathetic, but not too sympathetic. He said, because if you're too sympathetic, you will increase the delusion in someone's mind that this is a big problem. Isn't that interesting? He said, because sooner or later, we must have the courage to face what's coming to us with faith in the power of the light to overcome everything. And above all, that's what we need to be able to communicate if we're really going to help one another. Yes, we've all walked on those dark streets. We all know what it feels like to be in that darkness. What could be worse than what the disciples experienced? What could be worse than that feeling in Mary Magdalene's heart that not only has he died, but they've stolen his body? And then what comes after it? There he is. And she tells others, I have seen the resurrected Christ. And not everyone believes her. Imagine, she's completely emotional all the time. She comes into Jesus where he's having dinner. She bows down in front of him. She washes his feet with her hair. She's weeping at the cross. She's an admirable woman, no doubt about it. But imagine, people are saying, she tends to be a bit hysterical, And how do we really know that this has happened? We have to be sympathetic also to those who could not quite believe. But Mary says, I have seen him. I know he lives. So you can imagine, in the hearts of those who also love him, could it be true? He did raise Lazarus. Is it possible that yet the hope that we have is going to be fulfilled? Isn't this also the way faith is built in all of us? Someone who knows that all darkness ends in light says, be brave, be of good cheer, have courage, persevere. All darkness ends in light. One says, well, maybe for you. But I'm not so sure about me. And then the self-justifying ego comes and says, yes, but you've never suffered like I've suffered. We all do it. God, this is God's will. God is in charge of every atom of creation except the part defined right here. Right? And the whole world is bliss. Everything is light, but this is a permanent shadow. And even if we can't be so foolish as to articulate that, that's what the heart tells us, doesn't it? So there are the disciples. Mary is trying to say, he is risen. What is the reason for grief? He is risen. And the disciples are gathered together that evening in a locked room. Just picture the scene. They don't know who's going to be arrested next. This cohort has come. They've dragged Jesus away. They paused for the Sabbath. But does that mean that a whole general roundup isn't going to take place at this time? So they've undoubtedly snuck into that place. They're not in the temple. They're in a room with the door locked, just waiting to see what's going to happen next. And Mary is trying to say, don't worry. although Mary actually isn't present there because this is only the other disciples. They're undoubtedly talking about this. Peter and John have seen the empty tomb. And then, without the door being unlocked, suddenly Jesus, and the way the Bible says, Jesus appears in the midst of them. It's such an old story by now. We've read the word so many times, but it wasn't an old story when it happened for them. And it wasn't merely that he resurrected from the dead. It was that they were in a state of black despair and uncertainty. Where is this going to lead us? We had our lives planned out. We knew what we were going to do. And now all of it's been taken away. And suddenly Jesus appears in the midst of them. And what does he say? Peace be unto you. And the remarkable story here is not merely that this was not a vision. This was a flesh and blood person. And it's so charming the way they said it. He takes a little bread. He eats a little bit. He wants to show them that everything that you thought was final, everything that you thought was dark, everything that you thought was insurmountable is as nothing to the power of God. Now, in our broader reality that we live in today, and Paramhansa Yogananda in his autobiography gives several stories of masters being resurrected from the dead. At the time that Jesus was doing this, there wasn't this huge philosophical context for it. It was a singular event that utterly and completely transformed the lives of those who knew it happened. Now bear in mind, Jesus appeared to this many people, just a very small handful. But he also says to them in that moment, as my Father sent me into this world, I am now sending you out. So that gift that was given to them was not, oh, now we're safe. It was, here's a message. Here is a divine responsibility that now you have seen and you have believed. You have to carry that message forward. Now that's the real commission. That's the real universal point, you might say, of Jesus' resurrection, because everyone who lives in this world has this same experience. For a time, everything works just the way we want it, and we're so uplifted, and then whatever happens, and it begins to sink again. Whether it happens just within our own mind, whether people and circumstances around us disappoint us as they inevitably do, whether our body betrays us and illness and death comes, whatever it is, for a while it's up, and then something happens and it goes down, and then it goes up. Yogananda put it, he said, pleasure is the interval between two pains. Pain is the interval between two pleasures. Isn't that so? That sooner or later, as Yogananda describes in Autobiography of a Yogi, he says what really becomes the compelling instrument for our desire for change is the anguishing monotony of it. It's an ingeniously beautiful phrase. The anguishing monotony of joy that then begins to diminish, and the heart longs so deeply for that perfect bliss. You know, if we didn't know it was ours by right, we would be much more content with the coming and going. Isn't that so? If we really knew that sorrow is as much our destiny as joy, then when the sorrow comes, it would be just the way things are. But the deep inner self, the soul within us, knows that our heritage is bliss. And whenever that bliss begins to diminish, however we have defined it, whether it's human love, whether it's physical health, whether it's youth, whether it's wealth, whatever we have attached, whatever we have defined is the source of that bliss to us. Whenever it begins to drift away, there's this anguishing sense of loss. There's this agonizing sense of this is not the way it's supposed to be. And for many, many incarnations, we keep fighting to get it back in those terms. I want more wealth. I want more health. I want more happiness in this way. I want someone who will take care of me. I was touched when I was... Anyway, I can't really go there for a moment. But just this thought that we have, that we own other people, and that we can compel them to behave in such a way that will please me. Master often spoke very scornfully. He said, what people call love is really saying, you please me. And when you cease pleasing me, I cease loving you. You know, the way a master loves us, he loves us without condition, without end. Jesus himself turning to Judas, do what you're about to do it quickly. But Judas was one of the 12 apostles, and Yogananda finishes that story most amazingly. He said, it took 2,000 years for Judas to expiate the sin of having betrayed his master in that way, but he did, because he was a very great soul. He was one of the 12. Master Jesus knew who he was when he chose him. You know, on one hand, it's astonishing to imagine that one who had the karma to be that close to Jesus could still be so ignorant. On the other hand, in an odd way, I find it comforting. Because it gives us all so much latitude for error, doesn't it? You know? And even Jesus taking the trouble to tell Peter. Jesus says, I'm going to a place where you cannot go. Peter says, I will go with you, Lord. I'll go with you anywhere. Peter was always apparently, really into the grandstand gesture. I'll go with you, Lord, wherever you go. And then Jesus so sweetly, will you? Will you? Actually, Peter, he says, 3 times before the dawn comes, you'll say you don't even know me. Now, Peter then fulfills that prophecy, but what a comfort it must have been for him to realize that Jesus knew that would happen. And so Judas too, he betrays his master. But then Yogananda tells us that in Yogananda's own lifetime, the soul that had been Jesus, having reincarnated many times and gone through whatever suffering was required, was born again as a disciple of Paramhansa Sri Ramakrishna in India. And Yogananda said, I knew him in this lifetime. What was he like? That would be the obvious question which Swami asked. What was he like? Very withdrawn, he said. He'd had enough of power and position. He was very withdrawn. And then Master Yogananda said, but he still had a little attachment to money. Imagine. And when some of the other disciples of Ramakrishna were teasing him for that, Ramakrishna turned to them and sternly said, no, he suffered enough for that. But then he was liberated in that life, Yogananda said. Jesus, through Ramakrishna, liberated him. Complete freedom. 2,000 years seems like a long time in human terms, but in eternity it doesn't seem that long, does it? Now, not all of you, I'm sure, are going to just take that story that I just told you and say, yeah, that's true. Some of you may have your doubts, but it's not my story. But the point of it is this. There's absolutely nothing you can do. Try as hard as you can. You can't do anything to separate yourself from God's love. You can't even turn on your own master and betray him and actually drive him away from you. How easy it is to drive away the people in our lives, isn't it? And how easily we run away from people who no longer please us. I love you, oh no, I don't anymore. As Master said, God laughs at those kind of promises. When Lahiri Mahashaya, wandering in the Himalaya, stumbles back, finds his way back to Babaji and Babaji's cave, Babaji the deathless master, and there the master greets him again. He says, I lost sight of you for a little time in the space between lifetimes, but I watched you as a child. And then Lahiri is there, and the master has kept his brass water pot shiny. His blanket is clean and folded. He's holding these things for the next incarnation, when the disciple comes back and with total love presents them to him again. Who can promise that? We can hope for that. We can aspire toward that. And the masters tell us we do find each other again. We find each other in the astral world. We find each other in the physical world. How else to explain, these remarkable affinities that we have for one another, or remarkable aversions that we have for one another? It's the middle of the story. But the point of this story is, there's nothing in life so dark that the power of God is not brighter. There's no pit so deep that the power of God's love is not already lower. That even no matter how far we go, eventually we will find that. And there's nothing we can do in our lives that can actually repudiate God's love in such a way that it won't come back to us the moment we are open to it. Even in the story of the resurrection of Christ, it's so dear. Thomas is not present when Jesus resurrects for the first time. And when he hears about it, because he's called Doubting Thomas, he says, well, all of you saw him, but I'm not going to believe it. Aren't we stubborn? I'm not going to believe it until he's right in front of me and I can see the wound in his side and the nail holes in his hand and put my hand into those holes. So then, later, Jesus appears to Thomas. And what does he say first? Here are the wounds in my hand. Put your hands in them. You know? And what he's saying to us is, it's so small, our little lives. We think it's all so important. This thought I had, that thought I had, this suffering I endured, this difficulty. And it's not that it doesn't happen. Jesus was crucified. He died. They had to go through that horror of that so that on a deeper level they would find that God had always been the same with them. In the Bhagavad Gita, the verse that's related to this is such a beautiful one. Because the answer to all of this, and the answer that Mary Magdalene expressed to us, she knew what she had received. She knew her heart. She knew who this man was to her. She did not doubt herself. So if he's going to die, then I will stand at the cross and watch him die. If he's going to be buried, then I will come as soon as I can and I will bury him. Whatever God has given me, I will keep my focus only on that one reality. This is my Lord, and this is what he has given me. Now, this is a great historical story that's so dramatic. We think, well, it's easy in that case, but that's not how it works for us. For us, it's the little, tiny, everlasting difficulties. This is what Ramurti was reading to us so beautifully. The crucifixion of wisdom by ignorance, of friendship by betrayal, of health by old age, of human happiness by just that little bit that it doesn't quite work. The crucifixion happens every day. But what do? We keep our mind on whatever God has given us. We keep our heart on the light beneath it. And it's not that it doesn't happen, but we wake from it and realize it was never what it seemed. Would the life of Christ, would the power and message of Christ have been what it is now if he hadn't been crucified and died? You see, it had to be. Would the power of your faith in God be what it is if it was never tested? Would your capacity to choose happiness in the face of all the evidence that says, no, now you must suffer, would it be what it is if it hadn't been tested? I heard recently a beautiful statement from my friend Jaya. Jaya is one of Ananda's founding members. He's teaching meditation in India. And actually the same thing happened to me, only I didn't respond as well. You've been teaching, some man interrupts, as they are wont to do there. Man interrupts and says, you've been doing these teachings for 40 years. What kind of power do you have? Powers do you have? And I suppose they expected him to go like that and manifest something, like that. Jaya, who's very thoughtful, he just stood like this because what powers does he have? He doesn't levitate. I've never seen him manifest anything. As far as I know, he's never resurrected anyone from the dead. He was a little bit at a loss. So he stood for a moment, then he said, I have the power to choose happiness in all circumstances. What more can you ask for? The Bhagavad Gita says, Ah, ye who into this ill world are come, fleeting and false this world, set your faith fast on me. This is God speaking. Fix heart and thought on me, adore me, bring offerings to me, make me prostrations, make me your supremest joy, and undivided unto my rest, your spirit shall be guided.